This episode of Mr. Hutchings History is now streaming on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all your favorite platforms like Castbox, Podcast Addict, and Amazon Music. Tune in now.
Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome to today's deep dive. We're going to be exploring World War II and its impact on women's economic roles in America. You sent us a really interesting Spotify episode from Mr. Hutchings History. It's called 44, Rosie the Riveter, How WWII Transformed Women's Economic Roles in the U.S. So we're going to use that as a jumping off point. It's fascinating how just an image like Rosie the Riveter can spark so many questions about social change, wartime propaganda, and the complexities of women's experiences during World War II.
Yeah, it really is. What's especially interesting is how Rosie's legacy continues to be debated even today. Some historians argue that the war was a turning point for women, while others think that the gains women made were superficial and were quickly reversed after the war.
It does seem like there's no easy answer. But before we dive into those different perspectives, let's set the scene. Pre-World War II, America was a very different place for women, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Women's economic participation was largely confined to traditional roles, like teaching, nursing, or clerical work. And married women were primarily expected to be homemakers. It really is hard to imagine that now.
It is. So how did World War II change all of that? How does Rosie the Riveter fit into all of this? She wasn't just one single image, was she?
You're right. There were multiple Rosies that were circulating during the war. There's the "We Can Do It" poster, which wasn't that well known at the time, but it was later rediscovered and became really popular during the feminist movement in the 1980s.
Right. And then there's the Norman Rockwell Rosie on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. She's flexing her muscles and sitting on a copy of Hitler's Mein Kampf. It's pretty amazing how both images, while so visually distinct, both really capture the idea of women taking on jobs previously held by men.
It really shows the power of images, especially during wartime. But it's important to remember that behind these images were real women facing real challenges.
Let's talk about those challenges. What kinds of jobs were women taking on during this time, and what were the working conditions like?
Well, millions of men were drafted into the military, so that created this massive labor shortage. Suddenly, industries like shipbuilding, aircraft manufacturing, and munitions production were in desperate need of workers.
That's where women came in.
Exactly. And we're not talking about just a few thousand women here. Between 1940 and 1945, the percentage of women in the workforce jumped from 27% to nearly 37%. And by 1945, nearly 25% of married women were working outside the home.
Wow, those are some incredible numbers. What specific kinds of jobs were they doing?
For example, in the shipbuilding industry, women were welders, electricians, and riveters. In aircraft manufacturing, they were assembling planes, inspecting parts, and even testing aircraft engines.
Wow, incredibly demanding and skilled work.
It was. One really fascinating example is the Willow Run bomber plant in Michigan. At its peak, this plant employed over 40,000 workers, and they were building B-24 Liberator bombers at an incredible rate of one every hour.
That must have been something to see.
It was. And a large number of those workers were women, like Roswell Monroe, a real-life Rosie, who became a symbol of all the women working at Willow Run.
It's amazing to think about these women building those bombers, knowing that they were contributing to something so much bigger than themselves. But it wasn't all positive, was it?
Unfortunately not. Women still face significant challenges.
Like what?
Well, for one thing, there was a persistent wage gap. Women were routinely paid less than men for doing the same job. They often earned less than half of what men made.
That's hard to believe, especially when everyone was supposed to be working together.
It really does speak to the deeply ingrained social norms of the time. A lot of people, especially men, just couldn't fathom the idea of women earning the same as men.
Even when they were doing the exact same work.
Right.
It's frustrating to think about all that talent and potential being wasted, simply because gender. Beyond the wage gap, were there other forms of discrimination?
Yes, sadly. Women often faced harassment. They had fewer opportunities for advancement, and they were often relegated to lower-skilled positions, even when they were more than capable. There were even some cases where women were denied access to training programs or apprenticeship opportunities that would have helped them advance.
It's a reminder that progress isn't always straightforward. It makes you wonder how those women dealt with all these challenges. Did they just accept it, or were there attempts to push back?
That's what makes things really interesting. Some women definitely felt pressured to conform, but there were others who challenged the status quo.
Oh, really? Do we know of any specific examples?
Yeah, absolutely. Some women organized labor unions, filed grievances against discrimination, and some even went on strike to demand better wages and working conditions.
Wow, that must have taken a lot of courage, especially back then, when women really weren't encouraged to be so outspoken.
Yeah, it did. Back then, challenging gender norms and speaking up for yourself could have serious social and professional consequences.
It's incredible that they were willing to take those risks. It makes you wonder how the government and society saw these women. Were they seen as patriotic heroes, or were they more like troublemakers?
That's a really complex question. I think it depends on who you ask. On the one hand, they needed women to work, and everyone acknowledged their contributions to the war. But at the same time, there was this anxiety about women stepping outside their traditional roles.
Right, like society was struggling with this sudden shift in gender dynamics.
Exactly. Some people were excited about it. They saw it as a positive step, but others were worried about what this meant for families, for society, even for masculinity.
It's interesting how the wartime propaganda reflects that. We were talking earlier about the different images of Rosie the Riveter. Some emphasized her strength, while others focused on her femininity. It seems like they were trying to balance empowering women while simultaneously reassuring everyone else that they weren't a threat.
That's a really interesting point. For instance, a lot of the posters and ads emphasized Rosie's patriotism and her commitment to the war effort.
Right. It's like they were saying, look, women can do these jobs, but they're still doing it for their country and their families.
Exactly.
It makes you wonder how the women themselves felt about being used as propaganda. Did it make them feel empowered, or did it feel manipulative?
It's hard to say. Some may have embraced it as a symbol of their contributions and their independence. Others may have seen it as very superficial, something that ignored the real issues they faced.
Right. They weren't just a monolithic group. They were real people with unique experiences.
Absolutely.
So what happened to these women after the war ended? Did they all go back to being housewives, or did they continue to work?
That's a really important question, and it gets right to the heart of Rosie's legacy. There's this popular idea that women were forced to go back home when the men came back from war. But it's much more complicated than that.
So what really happened?
Well, there was definitely pressure for women to return to their pre-war roles. The government had campaigns encouraging women to embrace domesticity, and the GI Bill, which provided benefits to returning soldiers, often gave men an advantage in the job market.
So it sounds like it was really difficult for women who wanted to keep working.
In many ways it was. However, a lot of women didn't want to give up their independence or the sense of purpose they had found during the war.
Right.
While the number of women working did decline, it wasn't a huge drop, and the war had a permanent impact on how society viewed women and their role in the workforce.
So even though some women left those industries,
Something fundamental had shifted. Exactly. You could say the genie was out of the bottle, women had proved they could handle tough jobs, and they had experienced financial independence, and those things couldn't be easily erased.
So it seems like the war pushed women into these roles, but it actually ended up being a catalyst for social change, even if it took a while.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
It changed the conversation about what women were capable of.
Exactly. And think about the feminist movement. In the 60s and 70s, it's not a coincidence that they rediscovered Rosie the Riveter.
Right.
That "We Can Do It" poster went from being a pretty obscure wartime image to a symbol of female empowerment.
It's interesting how an image can take on a whole new meaning decades later.
It is. It shows how historical interpretation changes over time.
So how did historians view Rosie during this time of feminist activism?
Well, there have always been a lot of different opinions. Some historians, the traditionalists, focused on wartime unity and women's contributions to the war effort. They saw it as a temporary thing.
Right.
They might point to people like Samuel Eliot Morison, who saw women's work as a necessary response to a national crisis.
And then you have the feminist perspective who saw it as a turning point in challenging traditional gender roles.
Exactly. Though they also recognized that many of the gains were lost. After the war, historians like Ruth Milkman argued that the war raised women's consciousness and laid the groundwork for later feminist movements.
But were there historians who disagreed, who didn't think the war was that transformative?
Oh yeah, absolutely. The revisionists came along in the 70s and 80s, and they had a much more critical view. Historians like Alice Kessler Harris questioned how much the war really changed things. They pointed out that a lot of women wanted to go back to their domestic roles after the war.
So basically they're saying It was just a temporary disruption. It didn't actually change anything.
That's a bit of an oversimplification.
Yeah.
But you get the idea. They argued that focusing on the war ignored the bigger issues. That continued to hold women back.
It's fascinating how different historians can see things so differently.
It is. And it's a reminder that there's never one right answer. Each interpretation adds something to our understanding.
So where does that leave us today? What is Rosie the Riveter's legacy?
Well, I think it's complicated. On the one hand, she's a symbol of women's strength and resilience, especially during a time of crisis. Her image is still inspiring.
Yeah, she's an icon.
She shows what women can do when they're given a chance. But on the other hand, Rosie's story also shows us that the fight for equality isn't over. We're still talking about her, debating her meaning. And that tells us we still haven't achieved true gender equality.
It's true. Progress isn't always a straight line.
It isn't.
I think one of the biggest takeaways from Rosie's story is the importance of challenging assumptions and pushing boundaries. Just like those women stepped up, we need to keep questioning things.
I agree. We all have a part to play.
So as we finish our deep dive, I want you to think about what Rosie the Riveter means to you.
What do you find inspiring about her? And what can we learn from her?
It's been an amazing journey, exploring her story and the impact of the war on women's lives.
Thanks for joining us.
And until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep fighting for a better world.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.